there is a civilization we think we know completely. Pyramids, pharaohs, gold masks staring out from glass cases in museums around the world. We have given its people names, dynasties, bloodlines, a tidy family tree stretching back 5,000 years. And that was the problem. Because when scientists finally opened the door that history had kept shut for a century, the actual genetic code locked inside mummified tissue, the ancient Egyptians did not simply confirm the story we had inherited. They complicated it. Quietly and then unmistakably, the DNA began to describe a lineage more layered, more connected, and more surprising than the textbooks allowed. This is not a story about names carved into stone. It is a story about the deeper names hidden inside cells, the ancestral signatures passed silently from parent to child for thousands of years, waiting in bone and tooth for someone to finally listen. And when researchers listened, what they heard did not match the map everyone had agreed on. For most of the 20th century, the story of ancient Egypt was told as a story of pure geography. Egypt sits where Africa ends and the Near East begins, and for a long time, scholars assumed that meant one of two things. Either the ancient Egyptians were essentially a Nile Valley extension of sub-Saharan Africa, shaped entirely by the river and the desert around them, or they were a Mediterranean people who happened to settle on African soil, their real cultural gravity pulling toward the Levant and beyond. Entire arguments, political, cultural, even nationalist, were built on top of this ambiguity because for most of that century, nobody actually had the tools to test it. The written record offered clues but not certainty. Egyptian art depicted the pharaohs and their people with a range of skin tones and features across 3,000 years of history, because Egypt itself changed across 3,000 years of history. Trade routes moved people. Conquest moved people. Marriage alliances moved people. The Nile was not a wall. It was a highway. And so the accepted story, if you could call it that, was really just an unresolved argument, one side insisting on deep African continuity, the other insisting on Near Eastern kinship, both sides working from incomplete evidence. Inscriptions, artistic style, skeletal measurements that were, by modern standards, crude and unreliable. For decades, that uncertainty simply sat there, unresolved, because ancient Egyptian DNA was considered nearly impossible to recover. The climate that preserved mummies so beautifully on the outside was, ironically, brutal on the inside. Heat degrades DNA. The chemicals used in mummification, resins, natron oils, were assumed to destroy genetic material even further. For years, the scientific consensus was almost a warning. Don't bother. Whatever ancient Egypt's true ancestry was, it seemed destined to stay buried under the sand along with everything else. Then came the first crack in that assumption. In the early 2010s, a team of researchers working with an unusually well-preserved set of mummies from the site of Abu Sur el-Melek, in Middle Egypt, decided to test the impossible anyway. They were not chasing pharaohs. These were ordinary Egyptians, priests, officials, everyday people, spanning roughly 1,300 years, from the New Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period and into Roman rule. If ancient DNA could survive anywhere in Egypt, this dry, sealed, relatively stable site gave it the best possible chance. What they found first was not the headline. It was the anomaly that made the headline possible. Site index equals 2-1. The mitochondrial DNA inside these mummies was better preserved than almost anyone expected /sites. Genetic material that should have decayed into unreadable fragments had, in dozens of cases, survived intact enough to sequence. That alone unsettled a long-standing assumption in the field. If Egyptian mummies could hold genetic memory this well, then an entire category of unknowable history had just become knowable. This is where the science had to enter carefully, because DNA tells different kinds of stories depending on which strand you are reading. Mitochondrial DNA is passed only from mother to child, generation after generation, largely unchanged, a maternal thread stretching backward in time. Autosomal DNA, the genome-wide data drawn from the nucleus, tells a broader story, the mixed inheritance from every ancestral line converging on one individual. Researchers working on the Abu Sur el-Melek mummies eventually recovered both. 90 individuals yielded mitochondrial genomes. 3 yielded genome-wide nuclear data, the first genome-wide information ever obtained from ancient Egyptian remains. It was not a large sample by modern genomic standards, but it was the first time anyone had asked the genome itself, rather than a painted coffin or a chiseled cartouche, where these people's ancestors had actually come from. If you enjoy this kind of evidence-driven journey into the hidden layers of human history, it's worth sticking around, because what the researchers found next did not settle the old argument. It reframed it entirely. The conventional expectation, going into the analysis, was that later foreign rule, the conquests of Alexander the Great, the Ptolemaic Greek dynasty, and eventually Rome, would have left a visible genetic fingerprint. Centuries of Greek and Roman administrators, soldiers, and settlers living in Egypt should, in theory, have pulled the population's ancestry noticeably toward the Aegean and the Mediterranean world over time. That was the hypothesis the team set out to test. Site index equals 7-1. Instead, the study found that modern Egyptians share more ancestry with sub-Saharan Africans than ancient Egyptians did, while the ancient Egyptians themselves were most closely related to ancient populations from the Near East. Site, not a slow drift toward Greece and Rome. Not a population reshaped by its conquerors. Something almost the opposite. Site index equals 4-1. Across the 13 centuries the mummies spanned, genetic continuity with populations from the Near East and Anatolia stayed remarkably stable. Site, even as pharaohs gave way to Greek kings and Greek kings gave way to Roman governors. Politically, Egypt was conquered again and again. Genetically, at least at this site and in this time window, its people barely moved. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal, and the signal pointed somewhere researchers had not fully anticipated. Here the story could have stopped at a single, clean answer. Ancient Egyptians were essentially a Near Eastern population that happened to live in Africa. But the deeper the analysis went, the less that framing held up as a complete picture. Site index equals 11-1. The genetic connections between ancient Egypt and the Near East appeared to reach back further than the mummies themselves. Researchers proposed that this admixture and affinity likely extended into Egypt's prehistory, long before the New Kingdom period the samples actually came from, shaped by millennia of overland and maritime contact, trade, diplomacy, migration, invasion, and forced deportation alike. Sites, in other words, the Near Eastern signal was not a late arrival. It looked ancient, folded into the population before the pyramids were even built. And that raised the harder question. If ancient Egypt was already this closely tied to the Near East thousands of years before Alexander ever crossed into Egypt, then where does the sub-Saharan African ancestry, the connection so many assumed was foundational, actually enter the story? This is where researchers had to lay out competing explanations rather than rushing toward a single tidy answer, because the honest picture is genuinely layered. One possibility is that the sub-Saharan component increased specifically after the period the mummies were sampled from, meaning it reflects population movement in the post-Roman era, through trans-Saharan trade networks, the spread of Arabic and Islam, and later migrations along the Nile corridor, rather than being the dominant ancestral signal of the pharaonic age itself. A second possibility is regional variation within Egypt across its long history. Upper Egypt, closer to Nubia and the African interior, may always have carried a different genetic profile than Lower Egypt near the Delta and the Mediterranean coast, and a single site in Middle Egypt cannot speak for the whole of a civilization that stretched along 1,000 miles of river. A third possibility, and perhaps the most important caveat of all, is one of sample size and geography. 3 genome-wide individuals, from one archaeological site, spanning one region of Egypt, is a narrow window into a civilization that lasted 3,000 years and stretched across a continent's edge. Researchers who conducted this work were careful to frame their findings as a beginning, not a final verdict, an argument for more ancient DNA from more sites, more periods, and more regions, not a closing of the case. What the evidence does support, without much ambiguity, is this. Site index equals 11-1. The ancient individuals studied carried a sub-Saharan African genetic component that was measurably lower, more than 11 percentage points lower, than the equivalent component found in modern Egyptian populations today. Site. The people living in the Nile Valley now are not simply the unchanged descendants of the people who built the temples at Karnak. Something happened, genetically, in the centuries between antiquity and the present, a slow, cumulative reshaping of ancestry that the old story, focused entirely on pharaohs and dynasties, never accounted for. That is the twist researchers did not go looking for. Not that ancient Egypt was disconnected from Africa, it was never that. But that the deepest, most stable genetic thread running through. The mummies analyzed so far pointed toward the Near East and Anatolia, while the African genetic signature so often assumed to define ancient Egyptian identity turned out to be, at least in this evidence, a story that intensified later, not one carved into the population from the very beginning. Why does this matter beyond one Nile Valley civilization thousands of years removed from us? Because it dismantles a habit of thinking that runs through almost every population's history, not just Egypt's, the assumption that ancestry is a straight line. That a people today are a clean, unbroken genetic echo of the people who lived in the same place millennia ago. Ancient Egypt's genome suggests something messier and, honestly, more human. A population that stayed remarkably stable through centuries of foreign political rule, and then transformed genetically during periods that left far less written record, far less monumental architecture, far less obvious historical drama. The quiet centuries, it turns out, may have reshaped the population more than the loud ones did. Picture the Nile at Abu Sir el-Melek the way it would have looked to the people whose bones were eventually recovered there. A narrow green ribbon cutting through desert on both sides, water buffalo and reed boats moving slow against the current, mud brick villages pressed close to the floodplain because beyond it, nothing grew. This was never an isolated world. Caravans moved east toward the Sinai and beyond it, the Levant. Ships moved north along the coast toward Crete, toward Cyprus, toward Anatolia. Nubian traders and soldiers moved north from the south. For thousands of years, this narrow strip of fertile land was one of the busiest genetic and cultural crossroads on the planet, and the DNA, when scientists finally learned how to ask it the right questions, simply confirmed what the geography always implied. Nobody living on a river connecting 3 continents stays genetically static for long. None of this diminishes ancient Egypt. If anything, it enlarges it. A civilization defined not by a single bloodline flowing unbroken from prehistory to the present, but by its position at the meeting point of Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean, absorbing, exchanging, and transforming across thousands of years, in patterns still being pieced together one degraded strand of mitochondrial DNA at a time. The pharaohs did not rule over a genetically sealed kingdom. They ruled over a living crossroads, and the evidence for that is written not in hieroglyphs, but in molecules that outlasted the ink. Researchers are careful, and rightly so, not to overstate what a handful of mummies from one site can prove about an empire that spanned 3,000 years and 1,000 miles of river. This is an early chapter, not a final one. More ancient genomes, from Upper Egypt, from earlier dynasties, from different social classes, will almost certainly refine, and possibly complicate, this picture further. That is not a weakness in the science. That is what real science looks like. Cautious claims, held loosely, revised as the evidence widens. If this kind of deep, evidence-based unraveling of the human past is the sort of thing that keeps you thinking long after the video ends, consider subscribing, because ancient Egypt is only one thread in a much larger tapestry, and there are far more forgotten meetings, hidden migrations, and buried ancestries still waiting inside the genome, for anyone patient enough to ask. We like to think of the past as settled. Names in a database, dynasties in order, a family tree with clean branches. But every so often, the evidence reminds us that history was never that simple, and neither are we. The people of ancient Egypt were not a single unbroken bloodline standing still against the current of time. They were something more complicated, more connected, and in many ways more remarkable, a civilization built, quite literally, from the meeting of continents. The names we gave them were never the whole story. The genome, it turns out, remembered more than the stone ever could.